I was working the reception desk at a small hotel in Quebec City when an American couple walked up, already looking annoyed. The husband leaned in and said they loved the place, but moving around town was a nightmare. I reached for a city map, but he waved it away. "That's not the problem," he said. "It's the language." "Why is everyone speaking French? This is North America." He went on about how it felt unwelcoming, how for tourism reasons people should really switch to English, at least for visitors. He honestly seemed confused that an entire province hadn't adjusted its identity to make his weekend easier. I remember nodding politely while thinking about how confident frustration can sound like logic if you let it talk long enough. A friend of mine works at a car rental desk at Heathrow Airport in London. One afternoon, an American family rented a car, drove off, and came back less than 10 minutes later. The father stormed inside, red-faced, shouting that they'd given him a broken vehicle. When my friend asked what was wrong, the man jabbed his finger in the air and said the steering wheel was on the wrong side. He called it a manufacturing defect and demanded a normal car immediately. He truly believed there was a global standard and that Britain had simply failed to follow it. My friend said the hardest part wasn't explaining right-hand driving. It was watching the man slowly realize the entire country wasn't going to apologize to him. I was once on a guided tour of old temples in Kyoto. Before entering each building, the guide gently reminded everyone to stay quiet and respectful. One American woman ignored this completely. She stood there on her phone, laughing loudly, telling someone back home how ancient everything was and how good the signal surprisingly was. When the guide softly asked her to step outside to finish her call, she sighed dramatically and said it wasn't a big deal. She pointed at the statues and joked that they couldn't hear her anyway. I remember the silence afterward feeling heavier than any argument could have been. I overheard a conversation in a cafe in Copenhagen where an American was chatting with the barista. He mentioned he'd been in Denmark for a few days and was confused. He hadn't seen any castles, any royal drama, nothing magical. The barista calmly explained that Denmark is a modern constitutional monarchy. The American frowned and asked if that meant no fairy tale stuff at all. He complained that the country wasn't living up to the story in his head. I watched the barista smile politely, the way you do when correcting someone feels pointless. I helped run a surf school in Costa Rica for a while. An American family signed up for lessons, and before we even reached the beach, the father pulled me aside. He asked very seriously about our policy on shark attacks. I told him incidents were extremely rare. He nodded, then asked about refunds. Full refund or partial credit if a shark bit one of his kids. He wasn't worried about safety so much as accounting. I stood there blinking, wondering how you even price a hypothetical disaster. One afternoon in Rome, around 4 o'clock, I watched an American man arguing with a barista. He wanted a large cappuccino. The barista politely explained they don't serve that drink after late morning. The man raised his voice, pointing at the espresso machine, saying he had money, and the barista had the tools, so the deal should be simple. When the barista shrugged and said that's just not how it's done here, the man stormed out, promising a terrible online review. I remember thinking the coffee would sleep just fine that night without his approval. I once guided a tour at Stonehenge. After explaining its history and purpose, an American man raised his hand and asked when the lights would turn on. He explained that he'd seen photos online with dramatic lighting and assumed there was a scheduled show. When I told him those images were from rare events or art installations, his shoulders slumped. He muttered about misleading advertising, like a concert had been canceled without warning. A friend of mine leads hiking tours in the Scottish Highlands. Halfway up a mountain, an American client stopped and asked where the escalator was. He genuinely thought there'd be an easier option for reaching the summit photos. When told they had to walk the rest of the way, he complained nonstop about safety and accessibility, insisting a place this popular back home would have installed a lift. My friend said the mountain didn't seem offended, just unmoved. At a market in Marrakesh, I watched a young American couple try to buy a lantern. The vendor named his price in dirhams. The American man laughed and offered $5 instead. When the vendor explained the actual exchange rate, the man refused to budge, saying $5 was generous enough for a place like this. They walked away empty-handed, complaining loudly about scams, while the vendor quietly reset his display like none of it mattered. While traveling through Vietnam, I met an American backpacker who hated the currency. He said the bills looked fake and the numbers were absurd. $20,000 for a sandwich sounded criminal to him. He pulled out a $1 bill and said the country should just use those. Easier for everyone, especially locals. I didn't argue. Sometimes silence is cheaper than exchange rates. On a safari in Tanzania, our guide repeatedly reminded everyone to stay inside the vehicle. When we stopped near a group of elephants, an American man leaned out and started making kissing noises, holding out a snack bar like he was calling a dog. The largest elephant turned and trumpeted so loudly the air shook. The man fell back into his seat, pale and shaking. The guide calmly told him the elephant wasn't interested in granola. The quiet afterward felt very educational. My sister once worked as a flight attendant on a route to Cairo. An American passenger asked if the plane would fly over the pyramids so he could get a photo. When she explained flight paths don't work like that, he suggested asking the pilot for a small detour. He even offered a tip. She said no amount of money could bend airspace laws, and he looked personally betrayed. A cousin of mine works near the Mona Lisa in Paris. He says Americans often complain about how small the painting is. One man was especially upset, saying the ticket price wasn't worth it. He suggested replacing the original with a giant high-definition screen so everyone could see it better. He honestly thought that would improve the experience. My cousin said he nodded, mostly to keep from laughing. I was guiding at Stonehenge again when another American stared at the stones and asked what movie they were built for. He guessed something sci-fi, maybe Transformers. When I explained the site was thousands of years old, he lost interest immediately, disappointed there'd be no celebrities around. A relative of mine was on safari in South Africa when they stopped near a resting lion. An American woman whispered loudly, asking if that was it. After a few minutes, she asked if the guide could make the lion roar, maybe by throwing something. She complained they'd paid a lot and expected more action. The guide calmly reminded her that wildlife doesn't run on schedules. While hiking in New Zealand, I met an American couple studying a map. They asked for help finding the Shire. They knew the movie set was somewhere else, but wanted the real village where hobbits lived. They seemed frustrated locals couldn't point them there. I didn't know how to explain fiction gently. At a restaurant in New Delhi, an American ordered a spicy dish and turned red after one bite. He waved down the waiter, demanding it be remade without spices. He asked for just chicken, sauce, maybe ketchup. The waiter stood frozen like someone had asked him to remove the soul from the food. On a canal tour in Amsterdam, an American man suggested draining the canals and paving them over for highways. He talked about efficiency, traffic flow, and wasted space. He saw centuries of history as a poor design choice that needed fixing. In a small restaurant in Tuscany, an American family grew impatient waiting for pizza. The father pointed at his watch and demanded food immediately. When the owner tried to explain in Italian that the oven needed time, he waved cash at her, offering money for speed. The room went silent. She looked at the bills, then walked away without a word. At a hostel in Rio, an American man complained that everyone ignored his Spanish. He said locals were rude for not understanding him. The receptionist explained again that Brazil speaks Portuguese. He looked unconvinced, like languages were optional preferences. At the Acropolis in Athens, a guide mentioned Athena, and an American teenager interrupted. Hey, he thought Hercules lived there. He didn't understand why so much effort went into a place dedicated to someone he only knew as a side character from a cartoon. A friend worked in a traditional cheese shop in Paris when an American tourist asked where the real cheese was. She wanted orange slices that melt on burgers. She thought the rest was decoration. The shop smelled offended. On a ferry through a Norwegian fjord, an American complained about the slow speed. He said staring at rocks and water for an hour was boring. He wanted to move on, treating the scenery like traffic instead of a destination. A friend guarding Buckingham Palace told me about a woman who offered him money to get the Queen for a selfie. She raised the offer when he didn't respond, confident it was a fair deal. He didn't move. She left annoyed, convinced customer service had failed her. In Madrid, an American couple complained that stores closed in the afternoon. They called it lazy and inefficient. They couldn't understand why a city wouldn't stay open just for them. At the Grand Palace in Bangkok, an American woman argued with guards about dress code rules. She shouted about her rights, ticket price, and the heat, standing in front of a sacred site like volume was authority. Outside Buckingham Palace again, I watched an American dad ask a guard to wave for a TikTok video. He offered money, suggested dances, and walked away muttering when nothing happened. I swear I saw the guard's eye twitch just once. I was working the reception